I want to ask you something. Who owns the river? Not a specific river. The river. The one that runs through the valley where the village is. The one everyone drinks from, fishes in, waters their crops with. The one that made the settlement possible in the first place. Nobody owns it. That's the point. It belongs to everyone. Which means, in a very important sense, it belongs to no one. History teaches us something about things that belong to no one. Someone will always figure out a way to act like it's theirs. I'm Brian. This is episode 16 of Love and Hard Money. Today we're going to talk about commons, shared resources, shared networks, shared infrastructure, and the iron law that governs what happens to them. We're going to walk from medieval English pastures to Venetian banking halls to the Eccles building in Washington, D.C. And then we're going to talk about what happens when, for the first time in recorded human history, you build a commons that nobody can capture. Picture a medieval English village. There's a commons in the center, a shared pasture. Every family in the village has the right to graze their animals on it. It works beautifully, as long as everyone exercises restraint, as long as the number of animals grazing doesn't exceed what the land can support. Now here's the problem that economist Garrett Hardin identified in a famous 1968 essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. Each villager faces a calculation. If I add one more cow to the commons, I capture the full benefit of that cow, the milk, the beef, the hide, but the cost of that extra cow, the overgrazing, the degraded pasture, is shared across the entire village. I get 100% of the upside. I pay maybe 2% of the downside. So I add the cow, and so does my neighbor and his neighbor. Each decision is individually rational. The collective outcome is catastrophic. The pasture collapses. Maybe the village starves. Nobody planned it. Nobody intended it. The tragedy isn't malice. The tragedy is math. The tragedy of the commons doesn't just happen to pastures. It happens to every undefended shared resource, every network, every pool of value that people depend on, but nobody owns. And throughout history, the solution has almost never been to leave the commons undefended. The solution has been for someone to seize it. Here's the unwritten but ironclad law of the commons. Every shared resource left undefended will eventually be captured. Not sometimes, not usually, every time. The details change, the costumes change, the vocabulary changes. The mechanism is identical. In medieval England, it was the landed gentry, the enclosure movement. Over roughly 3 centuries, common land that peasant families had grazed and farmed for generations was legally transferred to private ownership. If you want to understand why the English working class ended up crowded into industrial cities doing brutal factory work, start with enclosure. They didn't lose their land because they were lazy or incompetent. They lost it because the commons they depended on got captured, and they had no recourse. Move forward a few centuries to Venice. The Venetian Republic was one of the great financial powers of the medieval Mediterranean, the dominant trading and banking center of the eastern half of it, and at its center was a network, not a pasture, a ledger. On the Rialto, Venice's banking quarter, deposit bankers kept the books for merchants from across the known world. A trader from Constantinople and a trader from Bruges could settle a transaction without a single coin physically changing hands. The banker just moved numbers between their accounts. This was called gyro banking, book money. The ledger was the network. The trust in the ledger was the commons. It made Venice rich. But eventually, the bankers figured out something bankers always figure out. Since people trusted the ledger, you didn't actually have to hold all the coin behind every entry. You could lend out what was deposited. You could write credits into the books for borrowers, credits that spent like real deposits, that circulated like real deposits, that were real deposits as far as the network was concerned, even though the metal to back them didn't exist. As long as not everyone came for their coin at the same time, the ledger held. This was technically illegal in Venice. For 3 centuries, it happened anyway. The historical record shows that of 163 banks operating in the late medieval Venice, more than half failed. The network, the trust, the reputation, the settlement infrastructure. That was the commons. And the bankers learned to extract rent from it by quietly diluting it. More credits than coin, more claims than reserves. The commons was still usable. It just quietly, gradually transferred value from everyone who depended on it to the people who administered it. When reality eventually caught up, most spectacularly in the banking crisis of 1499, when a cascade of failures took down most of the Rialto's major banks in a matter of months, the crisis wasn't a surprise to the bankers. It was a surprise to everyone else. And here's the part that should chill you. When Venice finally tried to fix the problem, the state created a public bank, the Banco della Piazza di Rialto, in 1587, required by law to hold 100% reserves. It worked for a while. Then the state itself started borrowing against those reserves to fund its wars, and the dilution started over. Different administrator, same iron law. Sound familiar? The river still looked clean, right up until it didn't. People everywhere instinctually know not to poop in the well. One of the leading killers of household cats is kidney failure, and one of the biggest contributors is chronic dehydration. Cats just don't drink enough water. And one of the simplest ways to fix that is to move their water bowl across the room from their litter box. Cats won't drink near where they poop. They know, at the level of pure instinct, that you don't drink water that could be contaminated. No one, not even a cat, wants to drink contaminated water. It's obvious advice. It shouldn't need to be said, and yet every generation has to learn it again, because the incentive to dump upstream and let someone else deal with the consequences is always there. Here's the economic structure of upstream dumping. The person doing the dumping captures the full convenience of not disposing of their waste properly. The cost, the contaminated water, the sick children, the dead fish, is distributed across everyone downstream who drinks from the same source. The dumper pays almost nothing. The community pays everything. This is not an environmental metaphor. This is the precise structure of fractional reserve banking applied to a commodity money system. When a goldsmith issues more notes than he has gold, he is dumping upstream. He captures the benefit, the loans, the interest, the leverage. The cost? The degraded trustworthiness of every gold-backed note in circulation, the inflation, the eventual bank run, is distributed across everyone who holds those notes, everyone downstream, everyone who trusted the network. And the thing is, it works, for a while. The river still flows, the notes still circulate, the economy still functions, the fish are still alive. Until they aren't. The Venetian banking system ran this play for generations. The goldsmiths of London ran it in the 1600s, taking deposits of gold for safekeeping, then quietly issuing more receipts than they had metal in the vault, lending the difference at interest. The Bank of England formalized it in 1694, building the practice into the foundation of a national monetary system. In 1913, the United States institutionalized it, built the whole mechanism into law, gave it a building in Washington, and called it the Federal Reserve. But here's where the modern version is different from every previous version. Different in kind, not just in degree. In every previous iteration, there was a tether, gold, silver, some commodity with a supply you couldn't simply vote to expand. The upstream dumping was constrained by physical reality. You could issue more notes than you had gold, but you couldn't invent gold. Eventually, the river ran clean again, or it ran dry, but at least the mechanism was bounded. In 1971, Nixon cut the last tether. The dollar became pure fiat, money by decree, backed by nothing but confidence and legal compulsion. The river was now connected to an infinite reservoir, and the dumping accelerated. Money is not the unit. The dollar bill is not the commons. The satoshis are not the commons. The network is the commons. Think about what money actually is. Not the philosophy of it, but the practical function. It's a coordination layer. It's the shared infrastructure that lets a farmer in Iowa trade with a merchant in Singapore without ever meeting, without shared language, without mutual trust built over years. It's the settlement mechanism, the ledger, the river that flows through the entire economy. The unit, the dollar, the yen, the piece of 8, is just a token that rides on the network. You can have a good token riding on a corrupted network. You can have a debased token riding on a functional one. The network is what matters. The network is what has value. We are the network. We are the value. The network is what gets captured, which means we get captured. And this is the through line across every era we've discussed. The landed gentry didn't own dirt. They owned access to the agricultural network. They owned access to the agricultural network. The land, the water, the roads, the mills that made production possible. Control the network, collect the rent. The Venetian bankers didn't own gold. They owned the settlement network, the ledger, the trust, the clearing mechanism. Control the network, collect the spread. The Federal Reserve doesn't own dollars. It owns the dollar network, the reserve currency system, the correspondent banking infrastructure, the SWIFT connections, the ability to say who is in the system and who is out. Control the network, collect the seigniorage. And here's the brutal corollary. Whoever administers the commons decides the rules, and the rules always, eventually, favor whoever is administering them. This is not cynicism. This is history. It's as reliable as gravity. On June 22nd, 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, caught fire. This was not the first time it had caught fire. It had burned before, in 1936 and 1952. Industrial dumping had turned a river into a flammable liquid. The people who lived near it knew. The people who worked near it knew. But the dumpers were upstream. The costs were downstream, and the mechanism for making those two things connect didn't exist. The 1969 fire was the moment the country finally saw it. Time magazine ran the story. A national movement followed. The Clean Water Act passed 2 years later. I want to use this as a frame for a moment that happened in 2022. In February of that year, the United States government froze approximately $300 billion of Russian sovereign reserves held in the Western financial system. Now, you can have whatever view you want about the geopolitics of that moment. That's not my subject. My subject is what it reveals about the dollar network. Because here's what the world learned in that moment. The dollar network is not a neutral commons. It never was. It's administered by the United States government and its allies, and the administrators can decide at any moment, for any reason, that your access to the network is revoked. Your reserves, which you earned, which you saved, which by every formal definition you owned, can be frozen, seized, or deleted. The river caught fire. Not for Americans, not yet. For the Americans holding the match, it looked fine. But for the finance ministers of 100 countries around the world sitting on reserves denominated in a currency that a foreign government could simply turn off, the water was suddenly, visibly, undeniably on fire. Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, China, countries that had parked their national savings in the dollar network because it was, by reputation, the most trustworthy river in the world. They looked at each other, they considered their reserves, and they started asking a question they had never seriously asked before. Is there another river? Okay, let's step back from human history for a moment. Way back. Because the pattern I've been describing, commons emerges, commons gets exploited, commons collapses, isn't a human invention. It isn't a product of greed or capitalism or of any particular political arrangement. It is the oldest story on Earth. It predates us by billions of years. Every organism that has ever lived follows the exact same program. Find a resource, consume the resource, expand until the resource is exhausted, collapse. The algae bloom finds nutrients in the warm water and explodes. Millions of organisms consuming, reproducing, consuming more, until the oxygen is gone and the bloom dies in its own waste. The deer herd finds the valley with no predators and multiplies until the browse is stripped bare and the herd crashes. The locust, the bacteria in the petri dish, the reindeer introduced to St. Matthew Island in 1944, 19 animals that became 6,000 in 2 decades, then collapsed to 42 in a single winter when the lichen was gone. No exceptions, not one. Search the fossil record. Search the ecological literature. Every population that has ever encountered a resource without constraint has run the program to completion. Consume, peak, collapse. This is not evil. This is life. This is what 4 billion years of evolution produced, because in a world of scarcity and competition, the organism that extracts the most, fastest, wins, until it doesn't, and then the survivors start over. At some point in the last 100,000 years, something changed in one branch of the primate family. We developed the capacity to model what we cannot see. Not just to respond to immediate hunger, immediate threat, immediate opportunity, but to run a simulation. To look at the commons and project forward, to hold an abstract concept. If we all do this, none of us survive. And then, crucially, to communicate that concept to others, to build shared language around it, to coordinate behavior across a group, across a generation, across time itself, in response to a threat that hasn't happened yet. This is the most expensive piece of hardware evolution has ever built. The prefrontal cortex, the capacity for abstract modeling, language, and collective planning. It runs on more calories than any other organ. It took millions of years to develop. It required social structures of extraordinary complexity to maintain and transmit across generations. Evolution doesn't build expensive things without reason. This capacity exists because at some point, in some environment, the groups that could see the constraint, communicate it, and collectively modify their behavior survived, and the groups that couldn't, didn't. We are all the descendants of the ones who could. And here's the uncomfortable truth that follows from that. Most of the time, We don't use it. Most of the time, we run the old program. Find the resource, extract the resource. Let someone else worry about what comes next. The capacity is there, the hardware is installed, but the default is still the algae bloom, still the deer herd, still consume and expand until something external stops us. The commons gets captured, not because humans are uniquely evil. It gets captured because capture is the path of least resistance for a brain that spent most of its evolutionary history optimizing for immediate extraction. The Venetian banker issuing notes beyond his gold reserves isn't a monster. He's running an ancient program on modern hardware. The tragedy isn't that we're capable of destroying the commons. Every organism is capable of that. The tragedy is that we're the only ones capable of choosing differently, and we so rarely do. But sometimes we do. Sometimes the expensive brain gets used for what it was actually built for. Sometimes a group of people looks at the commons, really looks at it, sees the pattern, names the constraint, and builds something designed to hold. Not because they're saints, because they're smart enough to see that the alternative is the brutal petri dish of evolution. The 21 million cap is not an arbitrary number. It is a species using its most expensive capacity to encode a constraint into the commons before the extraction begins. Not a law, not a regulation, not a treaty that the next government can revoke. A mathematical boundary, collectively agreed upon, collectively enforced, built into the foundation before the first stone was laid. It is, in the full sweep of evolutionary history, a remarkable thing. Every other organism runs the program to completion. Consume, peak, collapse, repeat. Bitcoin is what it looks like when we use the capacity we actually have. I've told you a story with a pretty clear structure so far. The commons, the capture, the iron law, and now Bitcoin is the exception. The first commons that might actually hold. I believe that, but I want to earn that conclusion, not just assert it, because the history I've just walked through should make anyone honest a little suspicious of solutions that sound too clean. Here's the thing about Bitcoin that true believers sometimes gloss over. We are early, and early means contested. The protocol is real, the math holds, the 21 million cap is encoded and enforced, but the territory around the protocol, the layer 2 networks, the mining incentives, the government's norms, the inscription debates, the block size arguments, the fights about what Bitcoin is for, all of it is live. All of that is being negotiated right now. And whenever there is a negotiation, there are people trying to tilt the outcome their way. The Ordinals and inscriptions controversy wasn't just a technical spat. It's a contest over who gets to define the norms of the network. The block size war wasn't just engineering disagreements. It was an attempt by well-capitalized interests to steer the protocol toward outcomes that benefited them. Those same interests are still around today. Looking at you, Brian Armstrong. These people are not wearing top hats and twirling mustaches. Some of them are probably right about some things. But the pattern, sophisticated actors with resources and influence trying to shape the common toward their own ends, that pattern is as old as the first village pasture. The history of every commons is the history of sneaky bastards trying to get their extra cow in. I'm not saying Bitcoin is captured. I'm saying the pressure is real, and the vigilance has to be real. And anyone who tells you the work is done and the protocol is safe from human nature forever is selling you something. The reason this commons has held better than any before it is precisely because enough people understand the history well enough to see the play when it's being run. That's why this conversation matters. Not paranoia, pattern recognition. So let's talk about what's actually new. Not new like a new feature. new like a munition in an evolutionary sense of money that has never happened before. For 10,000 years of settled human civilization, every monetary network has had an administrator, a family, a guild, a church, a nation state, a central bank, someone whose hands were on the spigot, someone who could decide who was in and who was out, someone whose nephew needed a favor, someone who owed a debt to someone else. The administrator was always someone, and someone always had interests, and those interests always, eventually, bent the commons toward themselves. Bitcoin is administered by no one. I want to say that again because it sounds simple, and it's not simple. It's the most radical monetary fact in human history. Bitcoin is administered by no one. The rules of the Bitcoin network, the 21 million cap, the block reward schedule, the difficulty adjustment, the validation rules are not enforced by a person, an institution, a government, or a committee. They're enforced by mathematics running on hardware distributed across the entire planet, maintained by hundreds of thousands of nodes run by people just like you who have no central coordinator and no shared identity beyond their interest in the protocol's integrity. You can't call Bitcoin's headquarters and ask for an exception. There is no headquarters. You can't lobby the Bitcoin board. There is no board. You can't sanction Bitcoin the way you can sanction the dollar network, because there's no server to unplug, no reserve to freeze, no administrator to threaten. The farmer in Argentina watching inflation eat his family's savings can hold Bitcoin, and the people who cause that inflation have no mechanism to take it from him. The merchant in Nigeria can settle a transaction in Bitcoin, and no correspondent bank gets to decide whether that transaction is permitted. Same network, same rules, no gatekeeper. This isn't a technical achievement. It's a moral one. Every previous monetary commons was eventually captured, because capture was always possible. The incentive existed, the mechanism existed, and eventually the will existed. Bitcoin is the first attempt in human history to build a monetary commons where capture is not merely illegal or discouraged or socially frowned upon, but technically impossible at the protocol level. The well is finally, structurally, protected from the people with the strongest incentive to poop in it. I'd like to end where I started, with the river. For 10,000 years, every river that mattered, every monetary network that connected human beings across distance and time, ran through territory that someone controlled. The toll was built into the infrastructure. You could try to avoid the toll, but you couldn't avoid the river. You needed it too much. So you paid. You always paid. In interest, in seigniorage, in inflation, in frozen reserves, in the slow, invisible tax on everything you saved and everything you built. The toll takers changed costumes across the centuries. Landed gentry, Venetian merchant bankers, Dutch goldsmiths, the men in the room where the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed, the committee that meets 8 times a year in Washington to set the price of time itself. Different costumes, same toll booth. Every other organism runs the program to completion. Consume, peak, collapse, repeat. No exceptions. Not one. That's not a moral failure. That's biology. That's the default. But we are not only biology. We are the species that can see the cliff before we go over it, that can hold the concept of, if we all do this, none of us survive, and communicate it, and coordinate around it, and build something different in response. We don't always use that capacity. Mostly, we don't. The sneaky bastards are always there. The extra cow is always tempting. The upstream dump is always convenient. But sometimes, rarely, and with enormous effort, we do. What's happening now, slowly, noisily, imperfectly, contested at every step by people with enormous incentives to stop it, is the construction of a river with no toll booths, a monetary network with no administrator, a commons that belongs to everyone because it belongs to no one. Not a utopia, not a promise, a choice. Maybe the most important collective choice our species has ever made about how to organize the infrastructure of human cooperation. For 10,000 years, someone owned the well. Now, no one does. That changes everything. I'm Brian. This is Love and Hard Money. Please like and subscribe to the podcast and share it with at least one person. It really helps me to grow this thing. Stack sats. Love your family. See you next time.